The Wild West of Psychology, a story of friendship, fights, and the dark side of human nature. You ever heard of a place called Robbers Cave? It's in southeastern Oklahoma, near the Sand Boys Mountains. I'm going to take you there, but not just anywhere, into the heart of human nature. Buckle up, folks. We're about to explore one of the most fascinating and disturbing social experiments in history. It was summer 1954 when world-renowned psychologist Muzafer Sherif brought 22 12-year-old boys to Robbers Cave State Park. You see, Sherif was on a mission to test his realistic conflict theory, which claimed that groups would compete for limited resources even against their friends and allies, but come together in the face of a common disaster. Sounds like something out of Lord of the Flies, doesn't it? And, as it turns out, eerily similar to what actually happened. Sherif was born in the Ottoman Empire, can you believe that? He won a spot at Harvard, but soon realized that lab research on rats just wasn't cutting it. He wanted something more human. His fascination with social psychology was at an all-time high after World War II, and he scored a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to fund his research. The first experiment took place in 1953, at Middle Grove Park in upstate New York. Sherif divided 11-year-old boys into teams and pitted them against each other for prizes. He then tried to reunite them using events like a forest fire. The kids had no idea this was all part of an experiment. The idea was that they'd turn on each other, but instead, they remained friends through thick and thin. The results were so disappointing that Sherif's staff even got into a drunken brawl with him. Talk about a party foul. But here's the thing, he wasn't deterred. He took the grant money from the first experiment and decided to try again at Robbers Cave. Now, imagine 22 12-year-old boys, dropped in the middle of nowhere, with minimal supervision. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? Well, it was, but not quite how Sherif expected. At first, they were all smiles and teamwork. They even named their campsite Camp Middle Grove, yes, after the first experiment. Unaware that this was actually an exercise in conflict theory. As days turned into weeks, tensions began to rise. The boys started forming teams, competing for resources, and eventually, fighting each other. It was as if they'd forgotten how to be friends. Sherif had created a mini-society where groups were formed, alliances were made, and eventually, disaster struck. But here's the twist. Even in the midst of all this chaos, some boys started to come together again when faced with an outside threat, namely, a rival group from another camp who'd been secretly pitting them against each other. It was as if they remembered their original goal, survival. The outcome of Sherif's experiment was nothing short of astonishing and disturbing. Nearly 6 decades later, experts would label it unethical due to the lasting mental damage inflicted on its subjects. But what does this tell us about human nature? As we reflect on the Robbers Cave experiment, we are forced to confront our own darker tendencies. We see that even in the midst of friendship and cooperation, there lies a hidden capacity for conflict and competition. And when faced with external threats, whether it's a rival group or the environment itself, we can come together, but often at great cost. So what does this mean for us today? As individuals, as communities, and as societies? I think it means that we're all part of a delicate web of relationships, prone to conflict and cooperation in equal measure. And when faced with adversity, our true nature is revealed. Will we find common ground or succumb to the darkness within? The Robbers Cave experiment may have taken place over 60 years ago, but its lessons are still as relevant today as ever. As you walk away from this story, ask yourself, what lies beneath the surface of human nature? What secrets do our relationships hold? And what happens when we're pushed to our limits? Will we rise above or succumb to the darkness? The Wild West of Psychology indeed. It's a tale that'll leave you questioning the very fabric of our humanity, and maybe, just maybe, inspire us to create a different narrative for ourselves.